watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
Well, I will start with saying that in 1918, a book was published in the then Russia, a book by Professor Solomon Luria. It was called Anti-Semitism in the Ancient World. I remember reading that book in what used to be called samizdat, the type-printed books that were not officially allowed about 30 years ago. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that the most interesting thing about that book is the foreword. In his foreword, Professor Luria writes that he actually started working on that book, Anti-Semitism in the Ancient World, in, I think, 1914 or 1915. And then when what is known as the Great October Revolution occurred, 1917, he stopped working on the book. Because, writes Professor Luria, he thought that every historic research should be somehow relevant. And thus, there will be no more anti-Semitism after the Great October Revolution, because the reasons for the anti-Semitism, the regime, the Tsarist regime, disappeared. There was no use to continue the research. Mind you, the book was published in 1918, meaning max a year later. It took him just a couple of months, I guess, to realize that anti-Semitism was still a relevant issue and to resume working on that book. Starting with this sad sentence to, sad example rather, to kind of stress that unfortunately, I guess we can talk about different forms of anti-Semitism, different ways of anti-Semitism to act, but it's very difficult to be so optimistic as to say that after this or that social change, world change, even global change of the kind we witnessed just 20-something years ago, anti-Semitism basically disappears. On the contrary, in the report that we prepared, and you kindly mentioned that it's part of my ministerial responsibilities, among other things. In the report that we prepared just 2 weeks ago, it unfortunately seems that 2009 was the worst year in the last 20 years in terms of the anti-Semitic acts, attacks, you name it, all over the world. I'm saying all over the world in order to stress that it's not just, this kind of a statistics game that we all know that, say, for that matter, in Canada, the situation was terrible, the numbers went up, and it kind of changed the whole statistical picture. That was not the case. All over the world, there was, unfortunately, according to the data we have, the worst situation since 1990. And I'm mentioning 1990 because this is considered the year when a kind of, I don't want to say scientific, but at least serious follow-up started on anti-Semitic events in different countries. I think that to really pass through this report, we have to say that there are two main types, with all the problematic definition of it, two main types of anti-Semitic events we are witnessing. We are going to deal today with what is called the new anti-Semitism, and I'll explain in a second why I have a problem with this term. But we should never forget that still, if we look at the report, in many places, definitely if we have some kind of geographic division here, in many places there are good old acts of anti-Semitism having nothing to do with Hezbollah or Hamas or Operation Cast Lead. Oh, well, the examples we all know. We can give the recent example, for example, of what happened just a month ago in a country called Moldova, in Kishinev, where a group of churchgoers led by a priest went to some menorah standing there, Chanukiah standing there in the street, uprooted it, even had some ceremony, with the main line being that the Jewish symbols shouldn't be so close to the church. The government apologized, the church leaders apologized, but the fact is, I promise you, that had nothing to do with IDF activities anywhere in the world. But at the same time, we definitely, if we are talking especially about 2009, we can't avoid the influence of the Middle East situation, what is happening in the state of Israel, with this ongoing, unfortunately, conflict, and its influence on acts of anti-Semitism. In some cases, like in a clear cut, I mean, when we are looking at a kind of caricature in a paper, and there is a, I don't know, the good old, once away, the good old description or picture of a Jew with a big nose and sticky fingers, either counting money or drinking blood, even if it says on this wonderful personality Israeli, or even if this fellow is wearing something that looks very much like IDF uniform, it's absolutely obvious that we are talking about, once again, something that for years, unfortunately for generations, used to symbolize the classic anti-Semitism. And at the same time, the reason I mentioned that it's kind of, I have a personal problem, it's not something that I'm pretending to write a thesis on, but I have a personal problem when we call it new anti-Semitism. It's not new. Because once again, going back to my personal history, I have to testify that in the 60s and the 70s, it was strictly forbidden to be an anti-Semite in the former Soviet Union. It was allowed, though, to attack Israel, Zionism, and so on and so forth. So the very caricatures, the very descriptions, the very stories about Israeli soldiers, I don't know, drinking blood or raping women or harvesting organs, were part of the official Soviet publications, never mentioning the Jews, the Israelis, the Zionists, the occupants, and so on and so forth. So we can't really factually say that this is new. But definitely, I do have to say first person singular. For me, it always associated with the terrible regime. I never could imagine that in Le Monde, or Figaro, or Guardian, for that matter, I would find the same descriptions 20, 30 years later. At the same time, and there is always this legitimate question, isn't it like a little bit simplifying? We can easily get to the situation when someone who criticizes Israel on anything and says, Mr. Edelstein, I don't like your policy, or I don't like your politics, I would immediately say, you're an anti-Semite. You don't have the right to talk to me like that. Definitely, we don't want to be in that place. So I think that we have to start looking for a definition. There's criticism of certain policies, certain governments, certain countries. What's different about this attitude towards Israel? I think that one of the definitions that many of my colleagues and myself have been using is the so-called 3D definition, with the 3 Ds standing for demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. And if we apply to certain things happening, acts, pictures, books, articles, the 3 Ds, we can try at least to define whether we are talking about someone who is legitimately not agreeing with something the state of Israel or the government of Israel or the people of Israel are doing, or we are talking about something that looks to me always in my head as, you know, this picture of a stream of water, that if you block it with stones, the water still tries to find the bypasses and the ways out. So now in this post-Holocaust world, whether a respected journalist, professor, political leader, elected official, can't write in a paper or can't write in a book anything about dirty Jews sucking blood of children. This stream of water somehow finds its way out in these new forms of hatred towards Israel, towards Zionists, and you basically just by using different terms give way to the same emotions. You know, the examples of that are definitely like the latest examples if we think about them, and they are probably connected to what we were just marking yesterday, the International Holocaust Victims Memorial Day, an official UN date. You know, the most terrible example, I had an opportunity to speak to the Secretary General of the UN the day before yesterday about it, is what happened with Haiti. The Israeli, as we all know, IDF medical, and not only medical, but rescue group was one of the first on the scenes. It was, according to all the sources, including what the UN said to me, it was very efficient. And at the same time, the internet was full of stories about Israelis going to Haiti in the first place to harvest organs. That was the reason that our delegation went there. Our group, our rescue team went there. So not official, not a single international body signed a thing like that. Not a single respected publication published anything like that. The internet is full. And no one is even trying to, you know what, in the very simple technique, to hide the sources. It's very easy to trace who started it, where it went from. No one is scared. And 2 days ago in the UN, during a press conference, was one of the deputy secretaries there about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Haiti. A Lebanese journalist asked the guy from the UN about the comments on the rumors or on the publications that the Israelis are harvesting organs in Haiti. So what I'm trying to say, that I guess this, as I've said, you know, this stream of water that is trying to find its way out finds its way out sometimes in such terrible forms that on one hand you say a normal person can't even think about things like that. But it turns out there are many persons who are, at least look quite normal, and are spreading these things around. And next to it, once again, you know, there are some cases that are not clear-cut cases. 3 days ago, on the eve of the Holocaust Memorial Day, a bishop in Poland says, with the logics of the book of Exodus we are reading these days in the synagogues, with more or less the same strange logics. He says, A, there was no Holocaust. Rich Jews invented it. B, what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians is Holocaust. So, I mean, here it's, you know, you can find, when I say there's no clear cut, you can find kind of both definitions. On one hand, the good classical approach. On the other hand, the modernization of anti-Semitism in its new form. Now, as I promised not to deliver a long speech, and I'm already doing something very contrary to what I promised, I would sum up with saying the situation is, as I've said, very, very bothering and troubling. At the same time, to be a little bit optimistic, I think that things could be done to address the situation. They could be done on a very practical level, and we are trying to do that, like, for example, legislation in different countries. I think that what happened in the last 15 years have been great progress in many countries around Europe, and even some countries outside Europe, in terms of proper forms of legislation. In some cases, it's against xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and so on, racial hatred, and so on. In some cases, it's specifically targeting anti-Semitism. But I think that there has been progress. There have been cases of persecution according to this legislation. So I think that there is some improvement in terms of that. And by the way, I'm very careful when I talk about the latest report. I'm very careful not to single out specific countries because the data is still coming in. So I don't want to say something and then in 2 weeks from now apologize and say, well, that's not exactly what I knew then. But I can say for a fact that in certain countries the situation is better than the others, not because the population is different, because the governments are taking an acting stand, they're fighting anti-Semitism, they're using the legislation, so you can see that in certain countries the situation is better. By the way, Germany is a good example. If I may give a positive example, and I hope I won't regret it after I get all the statistics. But except for legislation, we have an ongoing body, and I'm sure that people who are interested in it and are researching the field know about it. There's the Global Forum on Combating Anti-Semitism that just met in December in Jerusalem last time. But it's a kind of an ongoing forum of prominent leaders, academics, elected officials, human rights organizations, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is influence of that forum felt in different countries, especially to take into consideration the fact that we have inside it the group of members of parliament, international parliamentarian combat anti-Semitism force, by the way, Jews and non-Jews from different parliaments. And the immediate result, for example, of this group is that at least in 3 countries as of now, England, Italy, and Canada, there is a special official, there is a whole procedure, the official parliamentary committee on the investigation of anti-Semitism, the situation of anti-Semitism in those countries. The reports are being submitted, so there are immediate practical results. So to sum it up, as I've said, the situation is really worrying. At the same time, I think that we can get our act straight on it. There is no question, for me at least, we can question everything here, but there's no question about the connection between the things happening in our area and the immediate interpretation into hatred and acts of hatred towards Jews and Jewish communities around the world. But with a proper presentation of the problem, I think that we could try to change this terrible tendency of the rise in anti-Semitic attacks.
Something that's very important for me and for us. Recently, a lot of people have talked about the loss of interest of young Jews. One of the reasons people give is that we don't have the kind of galvanizing things going on that we used to, like the Soviet Jewry movement. I'm really hoping that you could, in a brief time, just talk a little bit about, for our audience who are under 35, about what was going on with the Jews in the Soviet Union. People really don't understand these days, young people.
Well, first of all, you're right. There were a number of code words for whole generations of Jews to identify themselves with the Jewish people, with the Jewish history, with the Jewish causes, and with the State of Israel. One of these code words was the fight for the Soviet Jewry that went on for over 20 years. It was a very good combination, I guess, of the general approach of many Jews to fight for the human rights, to fight against oppression, to fight for those who are in need of support and help. And at the same time, it was combined with the national cause. Let my people go. Zionism, Soviet Jews, the brothers who want to go to the State of Israel and are not allowed to. This cause, I think, was also unique because it united Jews from all over the world and Israelis around the same goals, the same cause. And I think that it also proved that when there is a good cause and we're united and we act properly, we can succeed. You definitely remember firsthand all the mockery that sometimes were witnessed from the Soviet authorities and the others, all those famous phrases. Will students and housewives be able to defeat the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union wasn't defeated even by superpowers. But it turned out that the answer to that question was yes. And the housewives and students and people of goodwill all around the world, Jewish activists, managed to help, so to say, the Iron Curtain to collapse and the Berlin Wall to collapse, and where the fight, the effort was the main reason for the fact that over 1 million Jews arrived to Israel in the last 2 decades from the republics of the former Soviet Union. To sum it up, I can say that it's a very good period, a difficult one, but a very good period in the Jewish history. But instead of just being nostalgic, and we should sometimes, because there are people who deserve it, people who led that fight, people who actively participated in that fight deserve recognition. But at the same time, except for just being nostalgic, we must try to learn what are the lessons of that fight. For me, one of the lessons is that if we act together and act for a good cause, we can definitely be very successful. So if we'll manage to find the common denominator for all of us to fight against anti-Semites and Jew haters and Israel haters from all around the world, I think that we can prevail and be successful and change the image of Israel and kind of fight back the wave of this new anti-Semitism that is arising.
Now, something that really wasn't reported on much in America, if at all, was that last year former President Carter went to Neve Daniel. Is that right? And I'm wondering what you have to say about his trip there.
Former President Carter went to Neve Daniel, a wonderful community where I happen to live. I think that it was another proof that seeing is different from hearing, as it says in the Jewish sources, because even President Carter, who is not exactly famous for his pro-Israel position and definitely not for his positive attitudes towards Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria, after visiting the community in Neve Daniel, after spending time with our mayor and with some residents, he couldn't avoid saying that some Jewish communities will stay forever under any arrangement, including that of Neve Daniel. And I think that it's just a challenge for us to make as many people as possible, including political leaders, to be a little bit more aware of what is really going on in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem, and to get rid of all those cliches about the Israeli occupation and the illegal settlements and all those words that are being used widely but are not taking us anywhere and are not reflecting the reality.
And finally, to go back to the issue of the former Soviet Union and the states that were under its control and influence in Hungary and East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia. Just briefly, what happened to you? You were arrested for teaching Hebrew.
I was, first of all, a student in Moscow in a college when I applied for an exit visa. It was back in '79. If you remember, there was the invasion of Afghanistan, so it influenced the whole atmosphere, and we were given what was called the refusal. We were denied exit visas. I was teaching Hebrew. I was taking part in all kinds of Jewish activities. Today, it seems like
which were illegal in the former Soviet Union.
They were, yes, they were illegal in the eyes of the authorities. There was definitely no legislation against teaching a foreign language, so many of us were charged on trumped-up charges. In my case, it was illegal possession of drugs, and I was successfully imprisoned for 3 years in the Gulag. Till this day, I can't answer the question whether drugs were planted in my apartment or not. I don't have a clue, but the accusations were still there. And I think that once again, going back to a question about the Soviet Jewry movement, if I want to slightly dramatize, I can say that the very fact that I'm able to give this interview today is due to the effort of many people around the world, that the moment I was arrested and charged wouldn't take no for an answer and were basically banging on the Iron Curtain and on the doors of every embassy and consulate of the Soviet Union all around the world, saying that they won't live with this situation when a young Hebrew teacher can be imprisoned on trumped-up charges, as well as many of my colleagues. And the result was that slowly but gradually, Gorbachev started the release of prisoners of Zion, and I was one of the last to be released, but it did happen, and in '87 I was granted an exit visa and moved to Israel.
Thank you so much, Minister. We appreciate your help. Thank you.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.